In the 2023 budget, government outlined a series of measures to mitigate the impact of the severe economic challenges and also to preserve growth. These include the implementation of flagship programs such as the One District, One Factory, Planting for Food and Jobs, Phase 2, Strategic Anchor Industries, Infrastructure Poverty Eradication and Program, IPEP, Ghana Cares, U-Start, Agenda 111, among others. Mr. Speaker, within the context of our IMF-backed PCPEC, these interventions assume greater significance in promoting growth and medium-term fiscal consolidation. In addition, as stated earlier, we are pursuing a social protection agenda to mitigate the impact of adjustment on the vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, in line with government's unwavering commitment to industrialization, the implementation of the flagship One District, One Factory initiative is on course. As of June 2023, 126 factories were operational nationwide. Over 160,000 direct and indirect jobs have been created, especially for the youth who have been mobilized to establish agro-processing factories in 58 districts. Mr. Speaker, government initiated Agenda 111 to address infrastructure deficits in the health sector and improve healthcare outcomes in the country post-COVID-19. As at May 2023, total payments under the program stood at $189 million, with 83 active projects on site in all 16 regions of the country. Mr. Speaker, Planting for Foods and Jobs has brought substantial improvements in Ghana's agriculture sector. This has resulted in increased food security, employment along agricultural value chains, and accessibility of raw materials for developing industries. The program has directly contributed to increased crop yields for major food staples such as maize, rice, and soya by 135%, 67%, and 18% respectively within the period. After a comprehensive review, government is finalizing PFJ Phase 2 to ensure a more efficient and targeted support for the agriculture sector. The key elements of Phase 2 are inputs credit systems, storage and distribution infrastructure, commodity trading, and digitized platforms. Mr. Speaker, I can also report that efforts towards promoting commercial agriculture, building technological capability, and advancing digitalization under the Ghana Cares program are on track. Last year, I indicated the government is spearheading the Economic Enclaves project to establish growth poles in key locations, including Kasunya, Greater Accra, Kumawu, Ashanti, and Banda in Oti regions. The approach under the EEP is to provide agriculture infrastructure and land development support to entrepreneurial youth and the private sector. Mr. Speaker, to enhance production and value addition in the enclaves, the provision of ancillary services such as housing, training facilities, irrigation canals, farm roads, and electricity have also commenced. Mr. Speaker, it is gratifying to note to the provision of these services, about 10 medium and large-scale entrepreneurs with experience in the commercial agriculture space have applied to play diverse roles ranging from anchor farmers to machine and equipment services in the EEP site in Kasunya. Mr. Speaker, in partnership with the National Service Team, about 20,000 acres of land in Setre Kumawu in the Ashanti region is being developed to accelerate maize, tomato, groundnuts, and animal production. Mr. Speaker, government expects that by end 2023, the DEP will have fully seeded some 7,500 acres of rice onboarded qualified private sector entrepreneurs as anchor farmers embarked on value chain activities such as rice milling and packaging in Kasunya, and developed and seeded 1,500 acres of lands in Kumawu and Banda, respectively, and also engage private sector partners in these enclaves and the school feeding program. The 2023 budget, for example, doubled the benefits under the LEAP program as well as boosted the allocations to the school feeding program. 3. strong and ambitious structural reforms in tax policy, revenue administration, public financial management, financial sector, as well as strong measures to enhance revenue mobilization and address weaknesses in the energy and cocoa sectors. Both are critical to bring public finances back on sustainable path while creating fiscal space for critical development spending. 4, to bring inflation under control through prudent monetary policy, including appropriate monetary policy tightening and the elimination of monetary financing of the budget. Containing inflation pressures requires coordination between fiscal and monetary policies. 5, to rebuild international reserve buffers to 3 months of import by the end of the program. The Bank of Ghana is pursuing enhanced exchange rate policies to help rebuild international reserves. 6, to restore sustainability and preserve financial stability following the domestic debt exchange program to support private investments and growth. And 7, to pursue reforms to encourage private investments, strengthen growth, and create more jobs. Mr. Speaker, it is instructive to note that our path towards securing an approved IMF-supported program has been characterized by speed and resoluteness. More specifically, the following key and significant milestones were accomplished. We achieved staff-level agreement in December 2022, 6 months after we formally requested for the IMF support to back our PC peg. We were supported by China's agreement to co-chair Ghana's Paris Club Official Creditor Committee. We secured financing assurances for the Official Credit Committee, co-chaired by China and France on 12 May 2023, 5 months after our formal request in December 2022. We secured an IMF board approval on 17 May 2023, 5 months after the SLA and 10 months after a formal request for a fund program.
That was Finance Minister Ken Ofori Atta in Parliament yesterday. We witnessed, and now the fallout, the aftermath of that. What are the salient, the crucial matters for discussion? The Finance Minister says we're rounding that curve and that the economy is turning around. But with the figures that Minority Leader Dr. Kasiala Toforson had to play with, he says, especially when GDP forecasts are not going our way, in fact, we are receding in that regard, then it does not point to the same picture that is painted by Ken Ofori Atta, the Finance Minister. Joining us for that conversation as we delve into the economy, we have Professor Isaac Bwedi. He is Dean, Faculty of Accounting with the University of Professional Studies. We'll also be joined by Professor Godfred Bokpin of the University of Ghana Business School, together with Dr. Theo Echampong, an economist and political risk analyst. But let's start with Professor Isaac Bwedi, Dean, Faculty of Accounting at the University for Professional Studies, Accra. Prof, a very good morning to you, sir.
And how are you doing?
Well, I'm okay. I hope you're well too.
Very well. And good morning to your viewers.
Great. Let's start with your assessment of, briefly, of course, a roundup of everything that happened yesterday. The Finance Minister, what he said about taxes and not imposing any further ones, what he said about infrastructure, what he said about the stabilization of the city, what he said about the domestic debt exchange program, and what he says about our economic fortunes going forward. Pivotally or crucially, he says we are turning the curve. We're rounding that bend. Do you support that narrative?
Yes, Ben, thank you very much for the opportunity. Yesterday was the media budget was reviewed, and to help your listeners to situate the discussions well, it's better to give just an introduction, overview of what the mid-year budget seeks to achieve. In fact, every year, the government accounts for how it has managed the economy for the first half of the year. And then it tells the citizens what they should expect for the rest of the year. And this time around, what has made it so topical or important is the country going back to for our IMF program just 3 years after ending the extended credit facility. Now, we wanted to know steps whether Ghanaians are going to be sacrificed in favor of IMF, although government enhanced domestic program with the fund has not yet started at a point in time. In fact, yesterday, the government gave a media review, and it was about the summary of the entire budget was the forecast, a slower growth in 2023, and then a higher inflation. These were two issues that were discussed. But Ben, let me also say that in the budget, that was, the media review, we didn't have any request for supplementary. It was just a revision of figures. Now, it was on 3 of 7 pillars. It provided us an update on economic performance for the first year, provided us an update on the implementation of IMF-supported PCPEG, including update on structural reforms and progress towards achieving the quantitative performance. And then it gave us an indication about the debt restructuring program, provide an overview, a revised fiscal framework. Now, we can't discuss this issue without looking at the global economic outlook. And that was what the government sought, the minister sought to do. It was to give us a global economic outlook that remains uncertain, despite declining food and energy prices. In fact, the latest PMI, that's Purchasing Managers Indices, point a rebound in economic activity driven mainly by the service sector. That's the global picture. So in the Ghanaian context, the 2023 budget statement, it was all about restoring and sustaining macro stability. That was what it was about. Now, let's come back to whether, in terms of my assessment of the entire budget, it was just to tell Ghanaians about IMF conditionalities and how we as a country, we are going to be whipped in line. So there were some projections that were given in a budget. For the first 6 months of the year, continue to make progress to exceed our non-oil revenue target. Some projections that came out. Then we're seeing some improvement in non-oil tax revenue. And then we had also supplementary budget not needed at this point in time. Let me also say that, in fact, if you look at the macroeconomic stabilities, let's start with the GDP. And then we move on to other indicators as well. We have been told of a growth in a real GDP, including oil. What was the target? It was 3.1. The 3.7, that was the target for 2023. The mid-year, the same year, around 2022, the mid-year, we were cruising to about 4-point-something%. Now, in terms of exchange rates, in March, Ghana cedi depreciated by 1.9%. Then in April, it was appreciated by 0.7%. We've seen a marginal recovery. And that also tells us that by the successful conclusion of the the domestic debt exchange program. So in terms of what we have seen so far since yesterday, we can say there's a slower growth, and there's a high inflation. And we also know that when these indices or these indicators are a bit high, we have other implications. And trust me, goods in that country becoming more internationally competitive, sometimes when it reduces. But then we didn't have this figure. Commercial banking lending also very high. We have a figure of I think mid-year 31%. So, Ben, these are my initial um, uh, submission when the budget was ready yesterday.
Mm. And if you look at, since you started on the global front, if today the graphic business, interestingly, captures a number of events from different countries, advanced economies, the United States, the Eurozone area, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, among others. And then it looks at other countries, for example, India, China, the emerging and developing countries in Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Then it comes to sub-Saharan Africa. So the tail of the tape, and something I was interested in finding out about the COVID-19 levy, but I'll put ice on that for now, because the World Health Organization announced in May that it no longer considered COVID-19 to be a, quote, global health emergency. Supply chains had largely recovered. Shipping costs and suppliers' delivery times were back to pandemic levels. So that is that. I'll come back to that point later. But the tail of the tape suggests that immediate concerns about the health of the banking sector have subsided globally, but high interest rates are filtering through the financial system. And we'll see those crippling, especially developing countries like ours, where the cost of credit now is so steep. This tends to be the general picture or the global picture from what we know. But in Ghana, fighting inflation and everything else, it is pretty problematic. From that standpoint, the global picture vis-a-vis our own picture and even our fallback when it comes to our gross domestic product expectations or growth expectations for 2023, the rest of the year. What do you make of that? Are we still in line to do something positive within 2023, economically speaking?
Yes, I think if you figures will not lie, and just as the minister indicated, and what we are seeing the global front, whatever happens in the global space obviously will affect our country as well. And we've seen the IMF also revising their budgets. Their growth targets. And that should also tell us that we should also do same. And that's what the government, yesterday also sought to cover. In fact, if you look at the revision and its areas, it covers. Anytime you try to revise your budget, then obviously it means that revenues are not coming. Therefore, you need to also do same. They mentioned about 4 or 5 areas, revision and areas that they cover. Overall, real GDP growth has been reduced to a rate of 1.5% from the initial target of 2.8%. And if you look at the non-oil revenue, real GDP growth, 1.5 to 3%, initial 3%. And then we also have primary balance that has also been reduced. Another area the government focused was a revision to the 2023 macroeconomic framework, and then revision of the GDP projections, revision of the 2020 financial fiscal framework, and then revision to the petroleum revenue. We are staying in line. I'm sure when the government is able to control excessive spending, then we should be on good course.
How are we going to be able to do that? Per the plan, per our expenses vis-a-vis the revenue we're raking in. Revenue is we still have a shortfall in there vis-a-vis our expenditure, even the figures that emanated from the early part of the year before now. How are we going to be able to do that? Because in terms of taxes, we're not adding on any component. Like I spoke to someone this morning, the person said, there's nothing left to tax. We've taxed everything. We're even taxing taxes themselves. So that is the first point. And then you look at the revenue opportunities, openings that are available. I don't know, but are we on the right course in that regard?
In 2023 budget, there were key tax policy proposals that are given. Remember, the government increased the VAT rate by 2.5% from 12.5 to 15%. And the idea is also to rake in revenue, reduction of the electronic transfer levy to 1%, and then there was a review of tax incentives and exemptions that was also increased. So concessional corporate tax was increased to 5%. There was a review of personal income tax. So if you look at the extreme ends of all the tax components, the direct tax and the indirect tax, the ones that we can transfer, the ones that we can't transfer, the service tax, the sales tax, were to a larger extent increased. But what I didn't find out in the recent review, I didn't see, was the performance of the government initiatives, the achievements against the targets.
When you speak of government initiatives, which ones are you referencing?
I'm talking about the One District, One Factory.
Okay.
The Ghana Priority Insurance Infrastructure Project, Agenda 111, and then agriculture, and then the food security. In fact, I would have loved to see performance target against actual. But what we saw in the budget, we didn't see the targets that were given in the previous budget and the figures that were churning. Per what we've seen. So if you come back to the question that we asked, how do we control the expenditure of the government? That is the will of the government to do that. And if the government is able to demonstrate that will, we know we should be in the right path of recovery.
But tell me, especially when it comes to the IMF program we're on, which we've latched on to, and our economic situation and getting out of it, some have said that apart from raking in more revenue, and of course you have a constrained space because our tax net isn't that broad, and the burden is on a small segment of the society, unless you're looking at indirect taxes, which hit everybody, regardless of who you are. But there's also been talk about cutting down on expenditure, cutting our coat according to our cloth. And that, Prof, is where we seem to be missing the point. That appears to be the missing link. Now, you made reference to the flagship programs, One Village, One Dam, One District, One Factory, and the host of them, Planting for Food and Jobs. You can talk about them. Free SHS. The question is, if we're going to go ahead with all of them, the IMF in itself pointed to the fact that even with free SHS, we were applying it in a way that wouldn't help us, essentially. What then do we do with these flagship programs? Look, recently we had another one of hotline documentaries, Thirsty Dams. Some of them are simply not working, like One Village, One Dam. Do we keep them? Do we keep pumping funds into them? What do we do to trim down on expenditure?
Yeah, Ben. In fact, that was what initially I indicated, the key government initiative program. In fact, we must say yes, we have gone through a lot of economic instability for a long time, and that is why the government also at the point in time has also initiated a lot of programs. If you look at the indicators, over the years, it's been inflation, for instance, being in 50-something percent all the way, and it's not coming down. Yes, although it's not to the point that we want it to be. And anytime there's a reduction a bit in inflation, that we know that things are moving on. But where we have a problem, as we indicated, is the will of the government to control the expenses of the items that the government, want to pursue. One Village, One Dam, yes, good initiative, very well. And the one I talked about, Agenda 111, I said, yes, they are all good programs. But then, if you tell me you have constructed 70 in your budget, I would love to see the target for the mid-year. What was the target, or what were the target for the mid-year? The rest of the project, what were the target? And I'm sure maybe we'll get the next opportunity by the government. Maybe you'll be able to tell us the budget against the budgeted figures against the actual. Agriculture and food security. We have been told that the government has directed a contributor to increase crop yield for major food staples such as maize. And that's by 135%. What was the target? How will the government be able to control the expenses on this area, in these areas? That's been my major concern. If you come back again, I'm sure I'll be able to throw more light on that.
If the finance minister then, when he says we have turned the corner, how optimistic he sounds, and he also intimates that the economy is in a better position now than it was 7 months ago. So let's say at the start of the year versus now. Are you in agreement with him, and why exactly?
Yes, we, as a country, and Ben, you rightly agree with me, in a global space, we've had a lot of issues right after COVID. Financial sector turbulence in the US, United States, the lingering geopolitical tension continue to keep uncertainty at the heightened levels. Difficult policy trade between and the sovereign debt as well in the red. Let's look at what happened a few months ago. The country was going through a very difficult period amidst unprecedented global turbulence. This was within the context of major external shocks and other credit rating downgrades. Remember, the Fitch, the other institutions were downgraded at a point in time, tightened domestic financing conditions. And then we also had an increased cost of borrowing. I'm just giving you a background to the statement that we are turning the corner. Yes, our country, like many other, also experienced unusual sharp increase in food, fertilizers, fuel prices, and then rising inflation. Exchange rate depreciation at a point in time we recorded, leading to severe economic challenges and hardship for the people. But the numbers that were given us yesterday, yes, we can see some lights, we can see some improvement in the figures. And I'm sure, despite our challenges in the country, we have saved many other extreme conditions. And that includes also the peace, the health, security as well, and then supply of power. So some of these issues are the ones that I can pinpoint and also conclude that, yes, we are turning the corner.
So he says we're turning the corner, but if you look at our growth projections from 3.4% revised to 2.8%, the minority hinges on that and said that is a clear sign that things are not as rosy as you're painting them to be. You look at inflation, where it still is, hovering around 42%. That is monumental. You'd have to go back over 20 years to get anything close to those figures. And back then, we went hippic. Here we are again at the doorstep of the IMF. Does that match the rhetoric of the finance minister?
Well, from where I sit, I play with figures.
Well, these two are figures.
Yes, if you go back to history, yes. Anytime you also play with figures, it's important to know the context. And what were the issues years ago? Did we have COVID? And I'm sure for this particular budget, was directly.
Prof, just a point. Sometimes when we talk about did we have COVID and all of that, every administration that from Rawlings has had its own issues. I could give you a plethora of major issues that the Rawlings administration faced at the time that they had to grapple with. And one thing they did very well with, for example, rural electrification, access to potable water to many communities. The Kufuor administration had same. The Atta Mills administration, same, myriad issues. We can talk about Dumso. Then someone would say, oh, it doesn't have to be global. They also faced major situations. So sometimes, like when I spoke to Bridget Jogbenuku, former flag bearer of the PPP this morning, if we're going to flog the horse of COVID-19 and the Russo-Ukrainian war, how about the other countries that are doing way better than we are, right here on the continent? Isn't that horse overflogged?
Yeah, Ben, I think we also need to understand in every economy, in every administration, obviously there will be challenges at a point in time. It will happen at any time in administration. So I am not supporting the fact that the performance for this administration not being the best because of the COVID and the Ukraine war, the geopolitics in that particular region that has triggered all these issues. In fact, I can also say that yes, the government has not shown commitment in the management of our revenue. Yes, it could be part. So at this point, let's face the reality, what we have at the moment.
Okay.
We are now at the IMF door. We were there years ago. 3 years. We have gone back again. What led us into that? And now we are here again, implementing the conditionalities of the IMF policy. In fact, that's all that we are doing at the moment. Dancing to their music. They are now telling us what we should do. And that is why the increment in taxes, and which also have other negative effects in terms of revenue. We keep also increasing the tax. What happens? So I am sure it is better to look at figures. It is better also to look at reasons. But we cannot discuss all these circumstances without looking at the global picture as well.
All right. Just hold for me. I have some people are targeting messages at you, Prof, but I'll hold for now. But this one says, Nicholas Asamoah says, government is doing its best in terms of rhetoric, in terms of talk. That's what he is saying. But let me introduce into the conversation Professor Godfred Bokpin. He's with the University of Ghana Business School. Prof, a very good morning to you.
Morning, and good morning to our cherished listeners.
You have...
And then the other speaker, I just seen it, so I...
Professor Isaac Bwedi of the UPSA.
Oh, okay. Prof, good morning.
All right, so let me get down to this bit. For you, since I've not got your appreciation yet, we've already started running with the conversation, but Ken Ofori Atta talks about revised growth figures from 3.4% to 2.8%. Then there is talk about the fact that our debt situation, our debt portfolio to GDP currently stands at 71.3%. And he says we're turning the corner. For you, what were your major takeaways? And do you agree, by and large, with Ken Ofori Atta when he says we are slowly getting out of the woods, so to speak?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, with the approval of the IMF-supported program, we've seen some stability, relative stability.
Prof, I'd be grateful if you could speak up a bit more for me.
Okay, yes, so thank you very much. Yes, of course, with the approval of the IMF-supported program, particularly with the inflows of the $600 million, and then also some of the fiscal consolidation measures that we are implementing, we've seen some relative stability, but it's too early to say that we are out of the woods. It's too early because the economy actually is not in full gear. Okay, you only say you have turned the corner when the economy is in full year and all the variables are turning in the right direction. For now, the economy is not in full year because we are not meeting all our commitments to all our stakeholders optimally. Because, and I'm saying this because we are suspending coupon payments on our external debt. That preserves some foreign currency for us. So if that enables stability, you cannot say you have turned the corner because your economy is not in full gear. We are not making all payments to all arrears, contractors, independent power producers, school feeding across the board. So you cannot say the numbers are turning out good because the economy is responding fully. No, your economy is not in full gear. So if you have suspended certain key things, for which reason you are seeing some stability, you could not conclude that you have turned the corner. Of course, we can see some relative stability and all of that, but the whole architect of the economy is not in operation. So you want to be very careful how you interpret that signal. And that is where the difference is.
So do you think the finance minister is being overly optimistic? Is he, so to speak, financially misleading us?
Let me tell you something, and it is characteristic of the current finance minister in the last 3 years and government overall. This is some characteristic of the MPP we used to know. Let me give you an example. 8 months ago, when the Minister of Finance appeared in Parliament, he was in finance, we say bullish, aggressively confident. And that reflected in the projections in the 2023 budget. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Right.
So look at the targets they set for us and the narrative they gave. They were going to turn things around quite quickly. They said they were going to bring inflation down to 18.9%. GDP will grow by 2.8%. I mean, all those things, 8 months down the line, the same minister showed up in Parliament, the same narrative, but this time round, revised all the macro targets. Now, end-year inflation more than 30%. That is why I'm saying that we are overly confident, aggressively confident, but it doesn't reflect reality. And therefore, if you see the margin, the variation, the variance, it tells you of a certain posture that does not mirror reality. That is what you see.
But the finance minister was real enough. The finance minister was real enough to say that 2022 was his most difficult year. He was real enough to say that. He did mention that we had suffered those exogenous shocks from the international system, COVID-19, the war in Russia and Ukraine, and so it hadn't been that rosy. He admitted that.
Neither has it been that easy the first half of 2023. Let me tell you something. This recovery we are talking about is coming at a great cost that we have not seen in recent times. It's coming at a very great cost. We need to appreciate that and put the sacrifice, the cost, side by side the recovery we are talking about, so that we're able to have a balanced posture that conveys the message that we sympathize with the sacrifices and the sufferings of Ghanaians, and that this recovery is at a great cost, and therefore we should look at it with a certain perspective. Let me tell you something. Have you seen the balance sheet of Bank of Ghana?
I have.
You know what I mean? That is a proxy of what this country has had to go through. The equity position of the central bank is hugely negative. Remember, that is a bank of last resort. If the government is hard pressed, if universal banks, rural banks, community banks, credit unions, if all of them are hard pressed, liquidity-wise, solvency-wise, they run to the central bank. That's the bank of last resort in lending. Now, the bank of last resort is in need of a bailout probably from a government that is already in a bailout arrangement. You call this one performance? We've done this to our national central bank, and you say we should clap for you? Please, where can we run to? And this tells you that the recovery will be slow and it will be painful.
There are.
It's simply because, look, when government did the first round of domestic debt testing, they said we should clap for them because it was hugely successful. But we said it was not, because the eligible bonds had to be reduced from 137 to 98 billion. Even with that, only 85% tendered at various interest rates, with the average weighted interest rate coming to about 8.3% from 19.3%. We ended up with just around 83 billion Ghana cedis out of the universe of domestic bonds eligible for restructuring in excess of 200 billion. Now, because government failed to make the much needed progress with the domestic debt restructuring, which effectively undermines our ability to reach debt sustainability, they had to load that difference on the balance sheet of the central bank. And that is why the central bank has had to take a deeper haircut, for which reason their equity is hugely negative. The central bank itself is telling us that they can only restore positive equity probably by 2027.
All right. So
this is what we are talking about.
Right.
It's just like the Bible telling us that you were bought with a price. So we have to be very careful.
Let's just get into this. Some of the comments coming through, I mean, some were taking on Professor Bwedi earlier. Some are also taking you on. But let me just reflect on some of those messages, even as we segue into the DDEP conversation, and then look at whether the economy indeed is better 7 months down the road, as Ken Ofori Atta says. So this one says, the IMF money has arrived in their pockets, so they don't feel the heat again. That's what they meant by we have turned the corner. That is what you are saying, Mba Mustafa. But these two comments, amidst the government is doing their best, but the domestic debt exchange is a harsh one on us, the Ghanaians. The domestic bonds, the higher influence and effect on the citizen. There was a comment that I wanted to go through. This one says, government is doing its best in terms of rhetoric, but Ernest Owusu-Ansah says, talk about the positives. We'll never meet all our payments. The government has done very, very well. Say that as a professor. The whole architect will not be in, or maybe architecture will not be in full gear. Always negative. And this one also says, from the same person, the USA is owing China, yet they don't complain, as the so-called professor wants to tell some of us. But Ernest Owusu-Ansah, unless you are also being very dishonest with yourself, the US has faced its own debt ceiling problems, with the Democrats having to literally beg the Republicans for that debt ceiling to be pushed up. So you cannot pick and choose, especially when the US has its own breathing space when it comes to the economy. Trillions of dollars that economy is worth. What is our economy worth? So sometimes when you're sending in messages, whatever your political coloration or whatever, let's think through those issues as well. But I'm putting that to you, Prof. This is what some of our listeners are saying. How do you react to that vis-a-vis our own position with our debt to GDP?
I respect their opinion. They are entitled to it. The point that I'm making is that if the economy improves, it should reflect in the pocket of ordinary Ghanaians. The World Bank just told us over 800,000 people have fallen into poverty. Inequality is widening. So whatever recovery, whatever corner we have turned, it must respond to these development outcomes. It must be inclusive. It must be broad-based. It must address the core issues that matter to every Ghanaian broadly. We are not denying that some relative stability is present. It is also a fact that sustaining that is also contingent on the reform, the measures we put in place. It's very important. We are not denying the fact that COVID-19 affected Ghana, just as it affected Cote d'Ivoire and other countries.
Right.
We are also putting the narrative that the impact of the pandemic across countries is not the same. And the difference has to do with the level of resilience of every country before and during the pandemic. And the marginality, you can see it from there. So if you think that, look, when you read the media review, the government itself is saying that the COVID-19, in essence, essentially revealed the local vulnerability, that there were pre-existing fiscal vulnerabilities. Pre-existing fiscal vulnerability. So in Ghana's case, we can talk about a global pandemic revealing local reality. We could have done politics all along about how well the economy is doing, but it takes pandemics of this nature to reveal the reality from the narrative. So, for instance, planting for food and jobs, if it had been done efficiently, it would have built resilience. We would have seen the effects in our food inflation. So, even in good times, when government has taken all the credit, we have also seen how global factors have aided that. We can so maybe we can, enough of the politics, right? But look at the data. We have been consistent in saying that, look, I'm just telling you that, do you think the governors at Bank of Ghana are happy with the annual report they publish? As a nation, are we happy that the central bank has been reduced to this level because of its overexposure to government? Are we happy? Are we happy seeing our pensioners picketing? The first time in our history, Ghana has had to restructure its domestic debt to this level.
Just hold for me, Prof. Let me also bring in Dr. Theo Champong, an economist and political risk analyst. There are some who are sharing messages and saying, talk is always cheap. Our learned professor is always preaching negativity. Later, I'll come back to you, Prof, so you react to that. But Rita Va says, Professor Bokpin always makes economic and financial analysis so easy, even for the layperson. He said recovery would be slow and painful, and Ghanaians should take him seriously and reduce our expenses. So it's a two-pronged affair. Dr. Theo Champong, if you look at, and I think earlier I may have used the global figure for our Ghanaian figure, 3.4 to 2.8% in terms of GDP growth. So in Ghana, it is 2.8%, now revised to 1.5%. I'd like to find out from you, from what you heard yesterday, does it reflect that we're rounding that corner, turning that bend in terms of our economy? And what are the pointers to that, if you see that, Dr. Champong?
Good morning, and I hope you can hear me. And
I can hear you loud and clear. Go ahead.
The conversation. I mean, look, when we speak about these issues, we speak from the basis of the evidence and the facts. So I struggle to see how people will say Prof and others, are being negative. It's driven by the data and the objective analysis that we're making, because many a time we had indicated that these economic challenges the economy was going to crash at some point. We were not listened to. We've been talking about the debt issues and all of that. So I struggle to see those who argue that we're being negative and all of that. It is the data that is leading to us to make those conclusions in that regard. And back to your main point, are we turning around the corner? It's still a long corner that we are turning. So there's some relative stability, and you can see that in some of the GDP numbers, in the inflation numbers, and also even in exchange rates. So for ordinary Ghanaian, two key things are important for them: inflation being low, exchange rate being stable. Since we got the domestic exchange and then the IMF program, those two key indicators have been relatively stable. But remember, they are still very, very high, right? Compared to the levels that they came down from. If you take inflation, we're talking in excess of 40%. The last reading was 42.5 or so percent. The central bank's own target for the year was originally inflation to be between 6 and 10%. So by that measure, we are far off from that target. If you look at exchange rate, a similar thing. So yes, we've had some relative stability, but from a point where things have actually deteriorated and we're now having to put in much more effort to ensure that we're able to sustain those gains, right, going forward. And if you look at the budget, the media budget that was announced, at least there are no new sort of taxes per se for many ordinary Ghanaians. And then number two, you also see the government making an adjustment to its revenue, which has come down, but you see a corresponding adjustment to expenditure as well, which for me is commendable and indicates that, there is some effort being made on the fiscal consolidation front. But then the trade-off with that, which Prof and others would talk or allude to, is that then you're not going to get the growth that you expect. So originally we were talking 2.8 or so percent. Now we're talking almost 1.5%. But those are the trade-offs and the balances that we've got to make. In addition, you see some expenditure controls being sort of introduced in this media budget. They talk about sanctions regime and having the same contracting format for public contracts. And if you're going to be issuing a contract now going forward without a payment order being issued to the GIFMIS system, you wouldn't be able, or the contract would not be valid. I think these are little things there that are positive that we can acknowledge, but by no means are we out of the woods yet. We've got to be very clear about that. We are still turning the corner, and we have not fully turned as yet. There's a whole set of issues that we can talk about when it comes to the central bank, Bank of Ghana, and the deficit financing and other issues related to that. But those would be my preliminary comments.
Just hold for me, Doc. So for those of you who are sending in messages, for the few who have sent in messages and said, we are sounding negative, the professors are sounding negative. They are saying they're using the data, basically, the numbers. And you cannot run away from the numbers. The same numbers that the finance minister played with are the same ones we're playing with here. But let me bring in the GUTA president, Joseph Obeng. Before the budget reading, or the media budget review, I should say, we sat here in the studio and you told me that you were looking forward to no taxes being added, maybe even some taxes being shaved off. And you had certain expectations as the business community. Tell me, having listened to Ken Ofori Atta yesterday, were you satisfied with what he told us? And do you think we are indeed turning the corner in terms of our economy?
Nothing really changed because our concerns are still not factored. And so we can say that the cost of doing business still remains. And that, hello?
Yes, I'm listening to you, Joseph Obeng.
And that inflation has not improved. At 42, we started inflation with 13.5 in first quarter of 2022. And so if inflation is 42, then what has got business thrives on these pillars: inflation, the interest rate, and then the exchange rate. The exchange rate has improved, but we need a sustained stability and then entrenched one. And that's what we have to be able to do for a longer time so that the actual benefits will be felt. And now the gains of this stability is not being felt because the cost of doing business, the excessive taxes that have been imposed on us are taking away the gains that we would have gotten. And so that's why we keep on saying that we should do everything to prune down the cost of doing business and then revise some of these taxes that have been imposed on us so that businesses can have the space to grow. The finance minister was talking about growth and all that. How do we grow when the environment is not right for growth? That we know that excessive taxations impede the growth of businesses. That we know that nuisance taxes impede the growth of businesses. A tax like COVID levy is definitely nuisance. The special import levy is definitely nuisance, and all of these should be taken out of the table, so that it will give a respite for for businesses. The way we are treating inflation is also not helping, because the inflation that we experience is a cost-push one, and then what we have to do is not to increase the monetary policy rate as a way of mopping up excess liquidity. What we have to do in that is to reduce expenditure. When you're able to prune down expenditure to the barest minimum, then of course we are saving the inflation and also reducing the inflation to transfer the benefits to the consuming public, the business community, and to salvage the economy at large. And so all of these things have not shown. And so we cannot say that we are turning. We have a lot more to do, and that's why we are going to still engage with the finance minister, as he has promised that our concerns will be factored in the November budget reading, and we'll pursue that.
So for you, we haven't turned the corner, but please explain, because at least no more taxes have been added. That was something you were hoping for. That is a positive, at least, isn't it?
No, taxes couldn't have been added on us because we are already suffocating. And
but we didn't come through with a supplementary budget. We could have done that.
No, but whatever it is, we are not expecting additional layer of taxes on business. Otherwise, it will be suicidal for the economy, because we are seriously suffocating. And nobody will even think about increasing taxes now. We can add, we can expand the tax net. That one, we don't have any problem with that. We can bring innovative ways to bring taxes around, but not to lump it up on the already stressed businesses. Though otherwise, those who have the capacity to even grow, the taxes are just being piled up on just a few. And that is what we have been talking about. The VAT, as it is also a major contributing factor even to the inflation that we are suffering. Before the VAT of 22%, the inflation was very low because we were paying flat rate of 3%. Just after the migration from the flat rate of 3%, where the standard rate is 22%, prices of goods and services shot up just after the introduction. So the VAT as it is, and even when it has so been increased, the finance minister admitted that it's not bringing the needed resources. But when we are paying a flat rate of 3%, government exceeded its target in the VAT as a tax. And so we have to revise and restructure the VAT itself. Well, because it's not productive, it's counterproductive to businesses. It's not business friendly. and then it does not ensure parity, it does not ensure fairness, and then it's creating problems. It has been complex because even in the same tax system that runs three different systems concurrently, those who are paying the standard rate of 22%, those who are paying the flat rate of 4%, and those who do not pay at all because of the threshold of 200,000, all working in the same. This is a consumption tax,
right?
But the consumption tax that the consumers are not paying, and so the business persons have to use their own resources to go and pay these taxes. It's not acceptable. So the VAT should be restructured, and then we will push it through the next budget.
Okay, a quick one. I want a quick reflection on this for me so we can move on. It is projected that in the coming months we should see some slide in inflation. That would be good for the business community. But then on the other hand, we know that as far as credit is concerned, it's being ramped up in terms of the cost of credit. In fact, the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of Ghana, the central bank, recently hiked that up, the policy rate, by 50 basis points, bringing it to about 30%. What has that done to you, the business community?
It is only compounding the cost of doing business. It's as simple as that. One have to contend with about 35% of cost of capital, cost of borrowing. Is too much. And then it does not make us competitive even in the sub-region. And the business that we do, we are not doing it isolation. We do it in competition with our neighboring countries. And we are losing out. And so the methodology that Bank of Ghana is using is wrong. To fight inflation, I think the best way is to reduce expenditure. If we're able to reduce expenditure drastically, then of course it is a way of mopping up the excess liquidity that the Bank of Ghana seek to have. But this inflation is as a result of accumulation of cost of doing business, including the taxes that we pay. So, and then the interest rate that is also added up on us. And so it's accumulation of all these factors. The utility bills that we pay, the utility have gone over 50%, and all adds up. So if we do not sit down to pull down on all these things and think that we are going to have a magic wand to bring the inflation down, then I'm afraid we are not going to have a better result on that.
Right. Professor Bweni, I want to come to you on this. The finance minister says that the DDEP has literally given government some breathing space. If I may just quote him, I want to quote from the words of the finance minister from his own mouth, so I don't say anything. He made mention of the fact that the DDEP had actually brought them some relief. I just want to use his specific words. I'll get to that shortly to get his specific words. Maybe I'll try to find it. But he says the DDEP has given them some sort of cushion. But let's look at the other side of the DDEP. And now we're talking about the dollar-denominated bonds or bills, among others, cocoa bills, among others, that in the next round are going to be affected. But we do know that as of now, government has given a 50% haircut to non-marketable holdings of the government of Ghana instruments, including long-term stocks and also a COVID-19 bond. When you look at the two sides, the DDEP and the gains, vis-a-vis the losses we are seeing in the system, the business community, the crumbling of the banking sector and credit, is this not a Pyrrhic victory where we are losing more than what we are gaining, Prof?
In response to your question, the debt operations or the domestic debt exchange program is about the fiscal flexibility of the government to contain some liquidity issues. But before I respond even to that, in fact, our viewers have had challenges with respect to the nomenclature turning, still turning. I don't know which word we should use now. But the right word should have been, we are still turning the corner. Then that would be the right approach to handle it. Yeah. I don't think every country will have an upward 100% indicator showing up. Definitely some will take a nosedive, and that's what we are. So I'll come back to your question, but let me respond to this. We've had a high inflation, that is fine. We've had a commercial banking lending rate. I mean, the same mid-year, 2022, the commercial bank lend rating, rate was about 22.5%, and now we are having 31.6%. In terms of the MPC, the monetary policy rate, the same year, the same period, was 19%, and now it's 30%. There's a high cost of borrowing, which we must admit. It means that our businesses will be suffering, and that is what we are seeing now. Coming back to your question on the domestic debt exchange program, yes, somewhere in a budget was indicated, and on the 5th December, the government launched the DD, the domestic debt exchange program, in a transparent manner, seeking to minimize the impact on bondholders, and that was the main thing the government sought to do. If you talk about the gains, I think to a larger extent that we've seen some impact on the debt restructuring. In fact, the financial sector, comprising the commercial bank, the specialized deposits taking institutions and insurance sectors, fund managers, the effect on debt operations on the financial sector, in terms of liquidity and solvency risks from impairment loss, I think we've seen some might not be at that major. If you check the numbers that we have, in fact, for the banks within this period, the bank have reported an increase in deposits and investment, higher profitability, and a return on equity. I think it's over, if I'm not mistaken, about 35% growth. If you also look at the profit before tax, and the same period, it's gone up to about 47%. And then profit after tax, I think, is hovering around 45.8%. Then, in terms of the return on assets for the entire period, that's the mid-year, I think it's around 5.5. It's an increase to about 5.5. They are all giving us some signal that there were some excesses, there were some challenges with respect to the domestic debt exchange program. But at least we are seeing some light. It's coming back for the past 3-4 months now. The financial sector, they've responded, not to the quantum that we wish to have. That's my reaction to your question.
Thanks for that reaction. Let me come to, were you going to add anything?
Oh, I was just trying to find out. I mean, let's also bring it out that the government also taking steps to curb what I've seen in the mid-year, which is also recommendable. I mean, recommendable to curb public debt, getting out of hands, which also is very important to mention. And then we also seen that 1.5% to 0%. There's also, government has also shown some willingness to reduce our debt level. That's what we should be clear here. Then we have also seen in the budget aggressively mobilizing domestic debt, revenue. And then we have also seen the government trying to streamline or rationalize expenditure as well, and both local productive capacity. But what we also need to also realize is that the government must show strong, signal a strict spending control, which is, I said earlier on, very important. We've seen some gains. Yes, we've seen some improvement. The government should also demonstrate how, to show commitment in controlling expenditure. I've said it already.
Okay.
Then direct more government expenditure into some productive sectors of the economy.
Right.
That is one.
Let me move on now to Professor Bokpin. Prof, now, government's flagship programs. I mean, we hear the finance minister saying, for example, that 1D, 1F, one district, one factory, has created 160,000 direct and indirect jobs. 160,000. But looking at government's flagship programs or projects in terms of their cost, the impact. Prof, can you hear me? Okay, so we'll try to get Professor Bokpin back on the line. It appears we don't have Professor Bokpin. But when you look at, from where you sit, Dr. Theo Champong, I will just come to you on that bit. I made mention of the fact that I'll come to you with the DDEP as well. From where you sit on the DDEP conversation, the second round, prospectively, that we're going to have, and the rhetoric of Finance Minister Ofori Atta that it is giving us some cash flexibility. Is this something we should be celebrating? What are going to be the pros and cons of this?
Okay, I mean, yes. Again, thank you.
Maybe, Doc. My apologies. Just to add to that, the exposure again of the Bank of Ghana in respect of the latest happenings and what we've added to our debt portfolio, and also the exposure of government as far as treasury bills are concerned. Maybe you can lump all of them together.
Yeah, sure. These are actually very big but important questions that need to be answered. So on the DDEP, first round is done. There's talk of a second round, but then again, you see, my point is we need some candor when it comes to this whole public policy debate or process. To the extent that people's livelihoods have actually been impacted in all of this process. So the banks, of course, have to take a hefty loss in all of that. But at the moment, the second round is touching or covering the cocoa bills. There is the U.S. dollar-denominated bonds as well. And then there's a third element of it, which many a time is actually missing from the debate, which is this attempt by government to restructure the IPP debt in that regard. And that's something that needs to be very carefully managed because of the exposure that the government has got to many of the energy producing companies. But in any case, with all this restructuring and the debt too that is ongoing and upcoming, people are going to be losing money. And the gain would be that the government saves on either interest or principal or a combination of the two. So it creates a bit of fiscal room, as we say, for itself. But the fundamental problem is even when we create that room, often historically, you look at the data, it doesn't take us too long to start, over leveraging or over borrowing again and finding ourselves in the same thing that cost us, or sent us to the likes of the IMF. Not long ago, we had the cash waterfall mechanism under the Energy Sector Recovery Plan, 2019. But at some point, we put all of those beautiful plans aside, and we've ended up in a position where the energy sector debt keeps going up and keeps accruing, and we're unable to pay to the point that now you want to force the IPPs to restructure that debt. On the Bank of Ghana thing, again, I think it's a very serious issue as well. And the fundamental problem is the extent to which fiscal policy dominates almost everything in this country, including the monetary policy. You look at the Bank of Ghana Act quickly, Act 612, and you look at the objects of the Bank of Ghana. And 3.1 or Section 3.1 says that the primary objective of the Bank of Ghana is to maintain stability in the general level of prices, basically to keep inflation under control. And then number 2 says that without prejudice to subsection 1, the bank shall support the general economic policy of the government to promote economic growth. And it has a very important clause. It says that independent of instructions from the central government or any other authority.
Right.
If you subjected the Bank of Ghana to these 2 key, objects and principles, they fail on that, on inflation, and then also even on the general price. And the reason is that they've been pumping a lot of money to support the government on account of the fact that the government could not borrow from the international commercial market. The data shows that they pumped in excess of 55 billion last year just to prop up, the treasury. And the problem is that all of those monies would go in and further drive the inflation. So in one sense, you're pushing or helping the government, but in another sense, it's defeating the core primary objective of the central bank, which is to maintain price stability. So you look at the inflation targeting framework, and it's all over the place.
Right.
And we are on target of 6 to 10%. Now we're talking 42%. So the issues are very important. Quickly to wrap up, and we also need some additional checks and balances on the Bank of Ghana's own operating expenses. You look at the annual report on page 55, and you look at some of the line items there. Foreign and domestic travel, it jumps from 28 million in 2021 to 97 million in 2022. Banking supervision expenses jumps from 77 million to 358 million. Motor vehicle maintenance and running costs, it jumps from 62 million to 132 million. So I think we need to interrogate them further, and we need further questions from the central bank when it comes to how they're going to reduce their operational expenses.
All right. Just to cap off the conversation, gentlemen, 30 seconds if you can. I'll start with you, Dr. Theo Champong. I believe I have you together with Professor Bwedi, and then we can wrap the conversation. For you, so what then is the way forward beyond the mid-year budget review? We've done this. The next one will be getting to the close of 2023. What are you looking forward to? What can we expect?
So for me, I think how we sustain the little progress or gains that we're making. We're still turning the corner. We're not there yet. The key thing now is what happens with the external debt restructuring. That would give us much, much bigger fiscal space. We need to keep improving on the revenue, but importantly, those expenditure controls, the new ones that are being introduced, like the having a payment order before a contract is issued, we need to push through on that. And then on the whole deficit financing argument, we've seen some positive indicators that the government is no longer borrowing from the Treasury or the central bank, and we want to see that being sustained going into the year. But the November budget is really going to be the big one, and I think all these COVID levies and COVID-19 levy, e-levy, things like that would either have to be reduced or scrapped going into the main budget.
Thank you so much, Dr. Theo Champong. Let me hear from you, Professor Bwedi, and then we can wrap the conversation. Hello, Prof.
Yes. Can you hear me, Ben?
I can hear you now. Please go ahead. You have about 30 seconds.
Yes, just to be brief. It's important to understand, have a pent-up picture of what the government painted yesterday. Slower growth and high inflation. We shouldn't forget. We want the government to take practical steps to arrest a high inflation and high cost of borrowing, very important. And then uncertain exchange rate, among others. I want to see some predictability when it comes to the key indicators. Manufacturers, policymakers, we can't predict the entire economy. So we need some amount of certain indicators to be able to predict the direction of the economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you too, sir. And that was Professor Isaac Bwedi, Dean, Faculty of Accounting at the University for Professional Studies, Accra. At a point, we were also joined by Professor Godfred Bokpin of the University of Ghana Business School, together with Dr. Theo Echampong, an economist and political risk analyst. We also had President of the Ghana Union of Traders Association, Joseph Obeng, joining the conversation. This is just the aftermath of the budget, the mid-year budget review. There's going to be a lot more talk in subsequent bulletins, in subsequent discussions on this show about the real breakdown and what this means for our country moving forward. Stephen Abwaje says, I don't know why government doesn't involve these technocrats rather than these something politicians. Anyway, some would also say that once these technocrats become politicians, then it's a different ballgame. But that is how we sew up the conversation for the first leg of the big stories. Still to come, we have a lot more. Again, we're also taking you to the West Hills Mall this weekend, where we have our next clinic of the Habitat Fair. So when you think of building, do you think of comfort? Do you think of affordability? Or do you think of luxury? Well, wherever you lie, we have you covered. Those conversations coming up next on the AM show. Do stay.